Hello, everybody. My name is Nitya, and today I will be presenting to you my IOC. This is an extract by the book The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. In this extract of the chapter The Man I Killed, we see how Tim O'Brien expresses his grievances after having killed a young Vietnamese soldier by a grenade. O'Brien lists some of the dead soldier's physical characteristics and the wounds that he inflicted and the possible life characteristics of the man. This passage gives a broad idea of O'Brien's internal conflicts with himself and how he isn't able to forgive himself for having killed an innocent young man even after his fellow soldiers tried to console him. For this commentary, I'd like to focus on the theme of the passage, which is O'Brien's guilt of having killed an innocent Vietnamese soldier. First, I'd like to discuss how O'Brien uses diction and tone. Second, I'd like to discuss how he uses imagery. And lastly, I'd like to examine how he uses irony. O'Brien uses different tones and diction throughout the passage. For example, from lines 1 to 3, he says, "Tim, it's a war. The guy wasn't Heidi. He had a weapon, right? It's a tough thing, for sure, but you got to cut out that staring." And he says, "Maybe you better lie down a minute." In these sentences, Kiowa uses passive diction to show his sympathy for O'Brien and how he wants O'Brien to forgive himself for killing the soldier, so that he can move on with his life. In line 4 to 5, Kiowa uses a very sentimental and tired tone when he says, "Take it slow, just go wherever the spirit takes you," because he knows that O'Brien is guilty of the act that he has committed and wants O'Brien to acknowledge that whatever he's done is normal in war and there is nothing to be worried about. In line 7, he uses neutral tone in the sentence, especially when he mentions the word butterfly. This shows how mystical and sudden death is and the fact that the butterfly didn't stop flying, and shows how life goes on despite death. In line 31, O'Brien says, "Okay, maybe I don't know." He uses a doubtful tone in the sentence, which shows that he isn't sure whether he is wrong for what he's done or whether he's right. But from the previous passages in the chapter, we know that he is definitely guilty. As the passage progresses, O'Brien uses visual imagery. For example, from lines 7 to 10, he says, "The butterfly was making its way along the young man's forehead, which was spotted with small dark freckles. The nose was undamaged, frail-looking, delicately boned young man." In these sentences, O'Brien uses parallelism when he repeats the physical characteristics of the dead man over and over again. This shows that this scenario of the dead man is being played over and over again in his head because it is hard for O'Brien to acknowledge the fact that he killed someone for the first time in his life and makes him feel guilty. From lines 13 to 14, he says he imagined covering his head and lying in a deep hole and closing his eyes and not moving until the war was over. In this sentence, O'Brien is imagining the dead boy's life and how he is trying to console himself by trying to show that the boy was unwilling to take part in war, and as a result, he died a painful death because of his unwilling participation in war. From lines 16 to 19, he says, "His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's, and at school the boys sometimes teased him about how pretty he was, the arched eyebrows and long, shapely fingers, and on the playground they mimicked a woman's walk and made fun of his smooth skin and his love for mathematics." In this sentence, he uses imagery to show that the young man acted and looked like a woman, which is why he was so weak and died a painful death. This shows that O'Brien is covering up the truth so that he doesn't have to believe that he actually killed a man. Lastly, O'Brien uses irony. From lines 7 to 12, O'Brien compares the tragic death of the Vietnamese soldier with the beauty of nature, which is quite ironic because he is discussing two different things and which are absolutely opposite things. From lines 10 to 12, he says, frail looking, delicately boned, the young man would not have wanted to be a soldier and in his heart would have feared performing badly in the battle. This is also ironic because O'Brien is showing his true character through imagining the past of the dead boy, because he was the one who feared taking part in war and wanted to go back home halfway through the war. Similarly, from lines 23 to 27, O'Brien connects very much to the dead soldier and is able to identify with the soldier, which makes him realize that death is terrible in nature. The whole passage is an irony itself because as O'Brien is talking about the past of the dead soldier, he is coincidentally identifying with the dead soldier and connecting to his nature. For example, from lines 21 to 23, he says, if he could not fight little boys, he thought, how could he ever become a soldier and fight the Americans with their airplanes and helicopters and bombs? As you can see, O'Brien is clearly talking about himself because initially, O'Brien didn't believe that war was right and thought that the country's reasons for going to war weren't solid enough. So as you can see, this passage reveals the character of Kiowa, who is trying to console O'Brien, and we can see the imaginative side of O'Brien, where he is trying to imagine the past of the dead soldier before his death and taking advice from his fellow soldiers to forget what he has done and move on with his life. So in conclusion, we see how O'Brien utilizes diction and tone to show that he is terribly guilty for killing the young soldier. He uses imagery to describe the dead body and show that he isn't able to forgive himself and move on with his life. And he uses irony in order to relate to the dead soldier and understand that death is miserable. And that at the end, O'Brien has to put aside his internal conflicts and be able to forgive himself so that he can move on with his life.